on the invalidity of dispensing or cancelling perpetual religious vows and the recent experience thereof in the Order of Malta, the Knights of Malta, of which I'm a member. So my theme concerns religious vows and secularization, in particular solemn, final and perpetual vows taken by solemnly professed religious, that is the vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, the three vows that are recommended for those who take them, sometimes called the evangelical counsels, meaning advice emanating from the gospel and from the words of our Lord himself. And my hypothesis is simply this. This is a vow, as all vows are, of a religious nature, made to God, not to some mere human agency. And so no human agency, merely human agency, can, in my submission, dispense from it, let alone at its discretion, so long as the vow is solemn, final, and perpetual. Obviously, temporary vows are a different matter. The only person who could possibly dispense from such vows is God himself. But not even God will do that, since God is always consistent with himself, and having created man in his own image, meaning with free will, God will not interfere with our freely chosen choices, even if he knows what they're going to be before they happen, and in a sense wills them. Likewise, as we shall see, there was no provision before or after the Second Vatican Council for the Apostolic See, whether for grave reasons or not, to dispense religious from properly made final, solemn, perpetual vows. And it was certainly not the case that such religious were free to marry, as many canon lawyers today erroneously assert. With the wide availability of what is now called, under the new Code of Canon Law, the indult of departure, many perhaps are not fully aware of the meaning of the phrase. The phrase is already, in my submission, so typical of the modern world. It is not an indult of change of circumstances, but rather of goodbye altogether, under which the Church washes its hands of the departed altogether, cutting them adrift to fend for themselves, sometimes even after years and years of solemn final perpetual vows and years of membership of a religious community. In my submission, it is a deeply shameful form of uncharity and abandonment, like a parent abandoning a difficult, disabled, or mentally defective child. In truth, contrary to the view of many modern canon lawyers and theologians, a genuine final solemn perpetual vow, religious vow, cannot, as I say, be dispensed by any human agency, including the Pope. The old 1917 code used a much better term, indult of secularization, for that is what it is, and did not pretend to dispense final solemn perpetual vows, but merely to secularize the religious, a different thing. So for the present, let's look at the current code, the 1983 code of John Paul II, and in particular canons 691 and 692. They are frequently cited as if the code of 1983 were a freestanding code that ignores all previous canonical and theological tradition, which of course it never can or could do. And they read as follows. Canon 691 subsection 1, a perpetually professed religious is not to request an indult of departure from an institute except for the gravest of causes, considered before the Lord. The religious is to present a petition to the supreme moderator of the institute, who is to transmit it along with a personal opinion and the opinion of the council to the competent authority. And Canon 692 reads, unless it has been rejected by the member in the act of notification, an indult of departure granted legitimately and made known to the member entails by the law itself dispensation from the vows and from all the obligations arising from profession. So what vows and what gravest of reasons? Doesn't say. As with all legal texts, these words must, in my submission, be interpreted in the context of previous legal meaning, tradition, and theological doctrine. So with that in mind, let's see what the 1917 code had to say. In that code, the wording is noticeably different from Canon 691 and 692 of the 1983 code. As with the pre-1917 decretals, the canon law of the Church, before the Church decided to codify its canon law in 1917. In the light of the traditional canonical and theological view, the indult of departure, or under the old code, secularization, can only, in my submission, refer to simple or temporary vows, which are, of course, dispensable, being only temporary, or to vows that never existed genuinely in the first place due to lack of consent, i.e., vows that can be annulled, like the annulment of marriage vows. And that, in my submission, is what it refers to. And the reason I say that is, let's look at the Code of 1917 and see what it legislated. In particular, Canon 638 of the old Code, to be compared with Canon 691 and indeed 686 of the new Code. It says this: an indult of staying outside the cloister, whether temporary, in which case it is an indult of exclaustration, or perpetual, in which case it is an indult of secularization, can only be given by the Apostolic See in a religion, which means a religious order, of pontifical right, in a religion of diocesan right, the local ordinary. And at chapter 4 of the old code, which is expressly headed on dismissed religious who have pronounced perpetual vows, Canon 669 says this, to be compared with Canon 701 in the new code. Paragraph 1, or section 1, subsection 1, a professed who has taken perpetual vows and who is dismissed from the religion remains bound by religious vows, with due regard for the constitutions and indults of the Apostolic See that determine otherwise. Well, what does that mean? Well, here's what the Catholic Encyclopedia of 1912 says, and bear in mind that's before the Code of 1917, when the old decretals were still in place. Perpetual secularization wholly removes the subject from his order, i.e. from the religious order, whose habit he puts off, and of which he no longer has the right to ask support without previous agreement. But the one secularized, and that's what's happened, they've gone from being a religious to a secular, does not cease to be a religious. His vows remain a permanent obligation, and he thus continues to observe the essentials of a religious life, even though he's been secularized. The vow of chastity, being purely negative, is observed in the world as in the cloister. The vow of obedience remains intact, but henceforth binds the subject to his bishop, to whom he owes not only canonical obedience like any cleric, but also the full religious obedience vowed at profession. I won't deal with what religious obedience means, because that's something that's also very badly understood these days. The vow of poverty necessarily undergoes alleviation with respect to temporal goods, but binds as to capacity to acquire and give away, as well as to bequeath, i.e. by will, without indults, which are readily granted at need. In the absence of indults, the property of the secularized person upon death goes to his order, and that was an order of the Sacred Congregation of Bishops and Regulars on the 6th of June 1836, which was still good law in 1917 and in 1912. Now, we'll come on to what it meant in chapter 4, with due regard for the constitutions and indults of the Apostolic See. An indult is normally, it comes from the word indulgence, indulgentia, meaning a permission to evade the normal law. And that is often used, oh, well, there you are, you see, that's what the indult of departure is. But is it? We shall see. As the Council of Trent so wisely put it at 25th session, chapter 1, for if those things that constitute the basis and foundation of all regular, by which it means religious, discipline, are not strictly observed, the whole edifice must necessarily fall. So you see, the tradition of the church is thus, and it could not be otherwise, or else the meaning of religious life would, according to the Council of Trent, be fatally compromised. And isn't that exactly what has happened since Vatican II, across the entire Western Church, as we know? What, in fact, can it mean to make a solemn, final, perpetual vow, if, in fact, the vow is not final and not perpetual? Perpetual means forever. If the vow can simply be reversed, then by definition it's not final and perpetual. The view that it can be reversed is cognitively dissonant. It's like a square circle. Simple vows, by contrast, being temporary and not final, can either be dispensed or lapse by a fluxion of time. But a perpetual vow must mean perpetual. And if it doesn't, what's the point of simple vows? You don't need to go through the process of simple vows preparatory to taking perpetual vows, if in fact perpetual vows are not perpetual and can be dispensed or lapse. Now, it has been argued by some, indeed by many, probably most canon lawyers, and certainly by journalists and even theologians, and in particular in an article I read in LifeSite News by a journalist whose name is Matthew Cullinan Hoffman. Some of you may know whom I don't know. He no longer works for LifeSite News, as follows. And he says this in a letter to me: "The Church has the power to relieve people of the obligation of their vows made to God, be they solemn, simple, or private. It's called a dispensation." He obviously thinks I'm completely stupid, that I don't know what a dispensation is. "When this is done, the vow is said to cease. This is something that anyone can learn by consulting the current 1983 Code of Canon Law." He goes on to say this: "It was also true in the 1917 Code of Canon Law, and it was true under the old regime of the Corpus Juris Canonici pre-1917 as well. In short, it's been true since the Church was founded by Christ. It has to do with the power of binding and loosing that our Lord gave to the apostles and their successors." Well, with great respect to Mr. Hoffman, as we've already seen, he's simply wrong about the 1917 Code. He's also wrong about the pre-1917 Code, which was not a code, it was a collection of decretals, as we shall shortly see. In fact, before 1917, there was no codified canon law. Like English common law or American law, the canon law of the Catholic Church consisted then of a collection of all the canonical decretals, decrees, and commentaries issued by the Church. It wasn't codified. Likewise, there was no provision before or after the Council for the Apostolic See, whether for grave reasons or otherwise, or out of its binding and loosing power to, quote, dispense, unquote, religious from fully consensual, properly made, final, solemn, perpetual vows. Indeed, one can no more dispense from a fully consensual, properly made, final, solemn, perpetual vow than one can dispense from a fully consensual, properly made marriage vow once the marriage is consummated. The new Code of 1983, as we saw, however, uses a new phrase, the phrase of indult, of departure, instead of secularization, as if you're getting off a bus. Some have formed the view that this change of terminology now permits the dissolution of a fully consensual, properly made, final, solemn, perpetual vow, as if such an ancient tradition can simply be erased by the stroke of a papal or other pen. Indeed, this view, I submit, reflects one of the gravest heresies currently subsisting in the modern church, i.e. that Catholic tradition can simply be abolished by ecclesiastical hierarchy at will, like some communist dictators diktat. Indeed, the practice, law and teaching of the Church that solemn, final and perpetual vows cannot be dispensed by any human authority has clearly, in my view, become an infallible teaching of the ordinary infallible magisterium of the Church, having been taught diachronically over time for 2,000 years, which of course is sufficient if it is universally accepted by the bishops and the popes and bishops in communion with him without dissent over a sufficiently lengthy period of time. That's the nature of the ordinary infallible magisterium. In short, putting it in simple layman's term, if it's an ancient tradition of the church, no one can abolish it. In the 1917 Code, there is no reference to an indult departure, such as now exists in Canon 691 and 692 of the 1983 Code. Neither was there a reference to such a phrase in the canonical decretals before 1917. The 1983 Code made reference to not requesting, if you remember, an indult of departure, except for, quote, the gravest of reasons considered before the Lord, which can and will entail, according to 692, if you remember, by the law itself, dispensation from the vows and from all the obligations arising from profession. So what can this mean? Interpreting those words in the light of previous canon law and Catholic doctrine. Those canons can only refer, and indeed must refer in the light of canonical tradition, to simple or temporary vows, which are dispensable, or to vows that never exist in the first place due to lack of consent or proper form, and thus were not truly perpetual solemn final vows, but only appeared to be so. The principle is the same as that behind the annulment of marriage vows, i.e. where the marriage vow was not fully and freely given, in proper form, intending to do what the church does, and so was from that time onward voidable. In the same way, the religious remains a religious, even if his religious vows are voidable, just as a married couple remain married, even if their marriage is voidable, until such time as they seek an annulment. And then the church will decide whether or not the marriage can be voided. And it's the same for religious. Thus we see that secularization, now weakly and untraditionally called departure, as if you're getting off a bus, as I said, does not remove that vow or the religious obligation, which remains, I submit, a permanent obligation. Those who claim that solemn perpetual vows simply cease upon departure or expulsion from an order are, in my submission, wrong. A religious order may expel some or all of its professed religious, whether for a good reason or not, but that does not release those expelled from their religious vows. That's the logic of the position. If any are still in doubt about this, then let them hear what the angelic doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas, has to say on the subject in the Summa Theologia. At Article 11 of question 88 of the Secunda Secundae, he asks the question whether it is possible to be dispensed from a solemn vow of continency. And he says, on the contrary, it is written, Sirach 26:20, no price is worthy of a continent soul. Further, quoting De Statute Monachatu at the end of that decretal, where another decretal, Cum ad Monasterium, of Pope Innocent III is cited, it is stated as follows, he says. The renouncing of property, like the keeping of chastity, is so bound up with the monastic rule that not even the sovereign pontiff can dispense from its observance. I answer that, says St. Thomas, since the decretal quoted says explicitly that not even the sovereign pontiff can dispense a monk from keeping chastity, it follows that we must maintain that, as stated above, Article 10, reply to objection 1, compared with Leviticus 27:9 to 28, whatsoever, however, has once been sanctified to the Lord cannot be put to any other use. For no ecclesiastical prelate can make that which is sanctified to lose its consecration, not even though it be something inanimate, for instance, a consecrated chalice, to be not consecrated so long as it remains entire. Much less, therefore, can a prelate make a human person that is consecrated to God cease to be consecrated so long as they live. Now, the solemnity of a vow consists in the kind of consecration or blessing of the person who takes the vow, as stated above in Article 7. Hence, no prelate of the Church can make a human person who has pronounced a solemn vow to be quit of that to which they are consecrated, e.g. one who is a priest to be a priest no more, although a prelate may, for some particular reason, inhibit him from exercising his order. In like manner, the Pope cannot make a man who has made his religious profession cease to be a religious, although certain jurists have ignorantly held the contrary. He doesn't mince his words, St. Thomas. The obligation of observing continency is an essential condition of the religious state, whereby a man renounces the world and binds himself wholly to God's service. For this is incompatible with matrimony, in which state a man is under the obligation of taking to himself a wife, of begetting children, of looking after his household, and of procuring what is necessary for these purposes. For this reason, the Church cannot dispense from a vow solemnized by the religious profession, and the reason assigned by the Decretal is because, quote, chastity is bound up with the monastic rule. There you have it. The reasoning given by the greatest theologian of the Church, given full approval by the Church, the angelic doctor himself, St. Thomas, the Holy Count of Aquino. I might add that the Decretal Cum ad Monasterium was still in being and in force as good law right up until the Code of 1917, when it was incorporated in effect in Canon 6, whichever one it was, 688, I think. References are often made, however, to other canons, but they make no difference to the ancient, unchanged and consistent teaching, tradition and law of the Catholic Church regarding the indissolubility of the solemn final perpetual religious vow. And nothing, in my submission, in the 1983 Code expressly contradicts that, nor could it. Now, it is not uncommon for non-lawyers to misinterpret the law, but perhaps in our age, uniquely, we now find that canon lawyers themselves misinterpret the law. This is partly, I suggest, a consequence of the modern trend and predilection for the codification of law, an idea that was reintroduced into international jurisprudence by the French Revolution, and at least in the revolutionary context, predicated upon the belief that the old law could be simply discarded as outmoded and a whole new system of law introduced. The French revolutionaries devised a whole new code based upon what they called les droits de l'homme, the rights of man. They invented many new rights predicated upon the revolutionary principles taught by the Enlightenment philosophers. The main idea, however, was discard the past and invent a new future. Thus, the new code of canon law, in a similar mentality, is seen as entirely freestanding, self-interpreting, and a system of law that owed nothing to the past, an idea that has but to be stated, in my submission, for its intrinsic absurdity to be immediately seen. Nevertheless, it has become the jurisprudence that now underpins the modern world, with the universities and colleges as the chief colporteurs of this intellectual bacillus. No matter how much the Church and its better canon lawyers emphasize the fact that a new code of law does not and cannot automatically dispense with the past, but must be interpreted in the light of past laws, and particularly doctrine and traditions, still, many, including many canon lawyers, continue to lean in the revolutionary direction, endorsing the view that mere positive law could overturn natural and divine law, which of course it can't. This, of course, is not only irrational, but also profoundly un-Catholic, not to say anti-Catholic. And it was and is all the more surprising, therefore, that any Catholic, let alone any Catholic lawyer or theologian, could endorse or accept such a view, and yet many have done so and continue to do so. It is, in my submission, of a piece with the even more spurious mentality that considers the Second Vatican Council to be a whole new schema of belief and doctrine that replaced and revolutionized the past teaching and practice of the Church. This mentality is not only a revolutionary mentality, but it is also a profoundly, in my submission, diabolical mentality, imitating the chief and primary sin of Satan, in that it refuses to serve God in the manner that he, God, has taught us. It's the modern version, if you like, of Satan's infamous dictum, non serviam, I shall not serve. The very essence of Catholic doctrine and law is its tradition, traditio, that which has been passed on, i.e. passed on since the time of the depositum fidei, the deposit of faith, the teaching of Christ himself and of the apostles. The passage of time allows us to understand that depositum better and better, taught, of course, by the divine interpreting authority, the magisterium of the Church. That is why, until 1917, the Church set its face, I suggest, against codification of the canon law, and relied instead upon the organic development of the law, as with the organic development of doctrine, in the form of a body of decretals, a system that English and American common law continue to endorse. Unlike the Code Napoleon civil law system, the anti-Christian Bonapartist system of law subsisting in the countries that Bonaparte invaded and seized. That may be a little bit unfair on the civil law system because they now themselves have a system of rather like the English and American common law of precedent. But to believe that one can change doctrine or long-standing tradition by mere positive ecclesiastical law is not Catholicism. It's the false ideology of legal positivism and is, in and of itself, heresy. It's as simple as that. It is as ludicrous as claiming one can legislate for the waves to go backwards or for circles to become squares. Clearly, you can't. Thus, in the new code, Canons 1194 and 701 must therefore, in my submission, be taken to refer to temporary or restricted vows which, as all agree, can, in proper circumstances, be dispensed or remitted, since they're not solemn and perpetual. Rather like an engagement to marry can be remitted. You're not committed. Canon 701 reads as follows. By legitimate dismissal, vows, as well as the rights and obligations deriving from profession, cease ipso facto. And that's what Mr. Hoffman was referring to in his article. Canon 1194 reads, a vow ceases by the lapse of the time designated to fulfill the obligation, by a substantial change of the matter promised, by the absence of a condition on which the vow depends, by the absence of the purpose of the vow, by dispensation, or by commutation. Now, once again, by dispensation, that's what Mr. Hoffman is referring to when he cites the Code of 1983 to rebut my position. But neither of those canons makes any reference to solemn final perpetual vows being dispensable, as is clear from their words. So, with all due respect to those who think otherwise, which clearly included the late unlamented Pope, if he was Pope, when a person is dismissed from an order, this does not cause the cessation of vows made in their profession, along with the obligations associated with them, but as we've seen above in the extract from St. Thomas, the very reverse, unless they're temporary vows or vows that are annullable. Solemn perpetual vows, properly made and fully consented to, are for life, and no human agency may dispense them, even if the person making them is expelled from the order in which he or she made them. Furthermore, a little thought will readily make clear that something, as I said earlier, cannot be both perpetual at the same time as not perpetual. This simply offends the prime principle of non-contradiction. Likewise, a little further thought makes it clear that if religious vows merely ceased upon leaving one's order or being expelled from it, whether by choice or expulsion, then corrupt ecclesiastical authority, and being human, any authority can become corrupt, would have a very diabolical weapon to hand to compel honest and faithful religious into submission to the corrupt will of that authority by threatening to abolish the chosen purpose of their lives, namely to live the evangelical counsels. I say diabolical advisedly, since all that would be necessary for the enemy to destroy the religious life, which is at the very core and centre of the Church's mission, would be to take over relevant ecclesiastical authority, as some say he already has, corrupt it, and then persuade it to expel religious from their orders, and thereby cause all religious vows to cease. End of religious life in the Catholic Church. Thus, the common but false interpretation of canon law would play directly into Satan's hands. The fact that this is indeed what some corrupt ecclesiastical authority in our time is trying to do merely reinforces what I'm saying. Indeed, in recent years, there were moves afoot within the 900-year-old Order of Malta by certain intriguers within and without the order intent upon secularizing the order, to claim the right to cancel the solemn final perpetual vows of the religiously professed members of the order, the Knights of Justice, as we call them, who take the full 3 vows of religion: poverty, chastity, and obedience. On the false interpretation of the 1983 Code of Canon Law, all that would have been necessary to demolish and destroy the religious life of the ancient order of Malta would have been to expel the professed from the order, or persuade them to leave voluntarily. And on that basis, according to the false interpretation, their vows would simply cease. The false interpretation thus plays straight into the hands of those who sought to secularize the order, and thus straight into the hands of the enemy. The making of a final solemn perpetual vow is no small thing. It is a very deep and serious commitment intended for life, like marriage, as the most full and solemn form of commitment to God, following the very counsels of our Lord himself, as to what lies at the heart and centre of the gospel. To argue that someone who has made such a commitment can have it torn away from them by merely expelling them from a religious order, for a good reason or for no good reason, has but to be stated for its evil to be instantly seen, I submit. It trivializes the most solemn commitment any person can make into something like a mere secular job specification or form of transient employment from which a person can simply be sacked. Worse still, if a superior can effectively cancel the solemn final perpetual vows of a religious merely by expelling him from his order, then, by the same logic, that same superior could also cancel his vows for other reasons of discipline or expediency. A fortiori, then, if the Pope can dispense a religious from his solemn, final and perpetual vows, then by the same authority he can cancel them unilaterally. Simply put, if vows are but a creature of ecclesiastical law, then, like any ecclesiastical law, they can be amended, repealed, and enlarged by the same ecclesiastical authority. That is what was being threatened in the Order of Malta. According to the 1983 Code of Canon Law, there are 4 types of religious community: religious institutes, secular institutes, societies of apostolic life, and public and private associations of the faithful. I pause to add that this, in and of itself, is an unhelpful system of categorization, since religious orders are private institutions, whose constitutions are determined by their members, and not by superior ecclesiastical authority. All that ecclesiastical authority can do is approve or disapprove those constitutions, and historically that's what the popes did, as they saw fit. It is not for ecclesiastical authority to dictate the circumstances under which an individual or groups of individuals shall choose to live the evangelical counsels. That would be a tyrannical and dictatorial interference upon the freedoms of the faithful to choose whatever lifestyle they think God has made for them. Anyone can choose to vow to God to live in poverty, chastity, or obedience, as counselled by our Lord himself, but we believe, in the church teaches, that it is better still if they do so with the formal approval of the church. But lack of that formal approval does not invalidate a vow or promise made to God, because such vows are profoundly personal acts of the will. Ecclesiastical authority is not there to make windows into men's souls and then to manipulate them. Such an idea is a diabolical idea, and was thus unsurprisingly a marked characteristic, you might say, of the late unlamented Pope. A religious community is a private institution, like a family, and is not owned by the church, still less by the Pope, but like any family, by its members. It is better if it has the approval of the church, but with or without that approval, it remains a private institution, owned and run by its members and not by the ecclesiastical hierarchy. This was something which seemed to be repudiated time and again by the late unlamented Pope, which he seemed to labour under the quite extraordinary delusion, if not, well, misapprehension, if not delusion, that he, as Pope, personally owned all the religious orders of the world. A claim so monstrously arrogant and insufferable as to beggar all belief. But he seems to have believed it. Did he create those orders? No. Did he finance and nurture those orders? Well, for the most part, no. He hasn't got the money, apart from anything else. Did he govern those orders? No, except in a very indirect sense. Did he labour night and day to make them a success? Certainly not. Then by what conceivable perversion of common sense, reason and logic could he claim to own them as if they were his own property, and then to do with them as he pleased? Nevertheless, I think it has to be said, he seems to have believed that. Yet even Satan himself doesn't make such a claim, however much he might like to. During the pontificate of the late unlamented Pope, a decree was promulgated entitled Cor Orans on the 1st of April 2018, claiming to tell religious orders how to run themselves in remarkably interfering and dictatorial terms. Let's just take the section on suppression alone, chapter 5, para 68. A monastery of nuns that cannot express, according to the contemplative nature and finality of the institute, the particular public witness to Christ and to Church, his bride, must be suppressed. Keeping in mind the usefulness to the Church and to the institute to which the monastery belongs. Never mind the usefulness to God or the rest of the community. Paragraph 72 says this: the assets, here we go. The assets of the suppressed monastery, respecting the will of the founders and donors, follow the surviving nuns, and go in proportion to the monasteries that receive them. So far, so good. Unless otherwise provided by the Holy See, which may dispose in individual cases of a portion of the assets or all of the assets to be given to charity, to the particular church within whose boundaries the monastery is located, to the federation and to the fund for the nuns, or to the Holy See. It is clear that by this decree the Holy See claims to act towards all religious orders as if the Holy See itself were its beneficial owner and not the religious themselves. An example of how this works in practice, well, there are many, but let me give you one: the convent of nuns in Amalfi in 2023, which some of you have read about. Now, okay, I only have this from the news stories, but if the news stories are to be believed, and frankly I think they mostly are, given other examples I could cite, the so-called, as it is, dicastery for institutes of consecrated life and societies of apostolic life, pause for a breath, what used to be called the Congregation for Religious, with the assent of the Pope, claimed the right to expel, in February 2023, 2 cloistered sisters from their order after they refused a request to leave a 7 centuries old monastery in Amalfi, dating back to the time of St. Francis of Assisi, for their refusal to abandon their 13th century convent, owned by their order and not by the Holy See. These nuns were dismissed by the Holy See from Amalfi, from the convent, from religious life. An act of such preposterous arrogance as to be almost laughable. 3 sisters had been, these 3 of them at any rate, had been the only nuns remaining in the convent. In 2021, the Vatican's dicastery for etc., 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 consecrated life, alphabet soup, ordered the convent closed due to the declining numbers. As if the Holy See had such power, which of course it does not, any more than it has power to close down your family because you didn't have enough children. Sorry, you only got 1 child. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you are no longer Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Go your way. What does that mean? I can remarry? Yes, off you go. A Franciscan priest from the sanctuary of St. Anthony of Padua was appointed, if you like, by the Holy See to oversee the closure, which of course, as if the Holy See had power, which of course it doesn't, to order such a closure. And this included the disposition of the property as if the Holy See owned all the property. It was a yet further act of utterly preposterous arrogance and diabolical tyranny, in my submission. All told, the value of the property belonging to the convent, chiefly the building itself, was estimated at 60 million euros. What was that about follow the money? The dicastery proposed that the sisters would be allowed to remain in the property for the rest of their lives if they signed over the legal ownership of the property directly to the Holy See's charity, which means the Holy See. By the way, a tacit admission that the Holy See did not own the convent or the property, at least legally, even if it thought it owned it beneficially. The sisters unwisely agreed. No sooner was the ink dry on the agreement than the dicastery ordered the nuns to leave. White men speak with forked tongue. And when two of them refused, decreed them expelled from religious life and their vows cancelled, at least so we're told by the news stories, and I'm willing to believe. The City Council of Ravallo came out in opposition to the closure, citing the historical and cultural significance of the convent, but to no avail. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the City Council were, if not Freemasons, at least not terribly good Catholics. So once again, the seculars, the Freemasons, and the anti-Catholics are behaving better than the prelates who supposedly run the Catholic Church. And we see this all too often. The nuns said, and I quote the news report at any rate, "In reality, we haven't been transferred, but dismissed from the order. As soon as we made the donation to the Pope, our transfer was decided. They were thus left to go and stay with their families, wholly abandoned by the Church. Meantime, it is understood that the Church intends to sell the property to hotel developers, doubtless for a huge sum. In reality, it was nothing short, I suggest, of grand theft by the late unlamented Pope. The pair left the Santa Chiara monastery on a Saturday after receiving a letter signed by Pope Francis telling them they were being relieved of their obligations, meaning their vows and vocation, which they had devoted the whole of their lives to. It is essentially a punishment, said Fabio Aderno, the lawyer for the sisters. And, he added, because it has been confirmed by Pope Francis, they can't appeal. The whole affair showed a scandalous disregard for the solemnity and personal nature of religious vows and for the private property of religious orders. In the case of the Order of Malta, it was claimed that the professed must live in community because, under the 1983 Code, they are a religious institute. Remember the four categories? And according to the Code of 1983, a member of a religious institute, according to this absurd, narrow categorization, must live together, despite the fact that the Knights of Justice have always lived in the world and not in community, even when they're on campaign fighting the infidels in the Holy Land. It was an entirely spurious argument, demolished first by the fact of tradition, and secondly, made even less coherent by the quasi-socialist, if not quasi-communist, tenor of the 1983 Code that claims to shoehorn all religious communities into four categories set out in the Code. This was a quite impossible stipulation, since all of the professed live in the world and have professional occupations, just as do, for example, consecrated virgins who live in the world. It was obvious that the stipulation, if followed through, would simply mean that the professed would eventually die out, and the order would become a purely secular organisation. But that, indeed, is what those intriguers within and without the order precisely wanted. However, it went further than that. There were threats, backed up by canon lawyers like, for example, Cardinal Gerlander, that if the professed refused to accede to this new stipulation, then they might have their vows cancelled by the Holy See. It was, in short, a threatened exercise of tyrannical power by the Holy See to serve the political aims of a few influential but corrupt members within the order. It was a threat, in my submission, of diabolical magnitude. This amply demonstrates, in my submission, how the idea that vows are but a creature of ecclesiastical law and can be dispensed or cancelled by ecclesiastical authority means that they, if that were true, could also be readily abused as an instrument of manipulation, oppression, and injustice in the hands of corrupt and unscrupulous prelates. But of course, we don't have any of those today, do we? Corrupt, unscrupulous prelates? Surely not. Isn't that right, Cardinal Cupich? Can the evangelical councils, the very heart of the Christian gospel and of the Christian religion, be regarded so lightly and frivolously? Of course not. In fact, as we've seen, the tradition of the church is such that any solemnly professed religious knight of the Order of Malta, who was expelled from the order, rightly or wrongly, expelled that is, would still be obliged to live his solemn perpetual vows for the rest of his life, just as a solemnly, finally, and perpetual professed Amalfi nuns would also have to do. And by the way, I can also say, at least speaking for England, all of those knights who were being threatened with cancellation of vows all said to me, when I spoke to them about it, well, I intend to live my vows privately, regardless of what anybody else says. I made them to God, and that's what I'm going to continue to do. There are, however, other historical precedents, and we perhaps ought to have a quick look at those. Suppression and expulsion have been tried before. So we have those precedents to hand, and again, in my submission, they prove the false interpretation wrong. In 1773, the Jesuit order was suppressed by the connivance of corrupt, secularizing politicians upon the then Pope Clement XIV, who, by the way, was a Franciscan, not a Jesuit. The Jesuits had already been suppressed in the Portuguese Empire in 1759, in the Kingdom of France in 1764, in the two Sicilies, Malta, Parma, and the Spanish Empire in 1767, and they were later expelled from the Holy Roman Empire in 1782. It was a conspiracy of Freemasonic prime ministers behind the backs of their Catholic kings. Count Aranda in Spain, the Duc de Choiseul in France, Prince Kaunitz in the Empire, and so on and so on. They all conspired together to get rid of the Jesuit order. What did the former Jesuits do? Were their vows regarded as having ceased or been cancelled merely by their expulsion? Not at all. And no one, least of all the then Pope and the Church, regarded their vows as having been ceased or cancelled. All of the suppressed Jesuits, many of whom had been barbarically imprisoned in the holds of ships and sent from all the four corners of the earth where their missions were, many thousands of miles across the high seas, to be dumped, living, sick, dying or dead, literally dumped on the shores of the Papal States, where, by the way, they were then repudiated by the Pope. So bad popes didn't just happen in the 21st or 20th century. But they remained faithful to and never abandoned their religious vows, every single one of them. Those that could reform themselves into communities and continue to live the Jesuit life and vows, but giving themselves different names, in obedience to ecclesiastical authority, legitimate obedience. So they would call themselves things like the Society of the Sacred Heart or something like that. But they carried on living their Jesuit vows, including the fourth vow, as best they could. St. Joseph Pignatelli, of the princes and dukes of Belmont, became their unofficial leader in exile in Sardinia, ensuring all Jesuits continued to live their vows, and he later supervised the restoration of the Jesuit order so successfully that he is considered by the Jesuits to be the second founder of the order and a saint. He was canonized on the 21st of May, 1933, by Pope Pius XI, an heroic example, I suggest, of patience and forbearance of a religious who, despite expulsion and suppression, nevertheless felt himself and indeed continued to live by his full religious vows. Now, although the Pope had and has the power to withdraw the Church's recognition of an order, he does not have the right to take over their property, still less to suppress their vows. The case of the Jesuits was admittedly complicated by their fourth vow of corpse-like obedience to the Pope. Maybe not such a good idea, that vow. But there could be no question of their vows being cancelled. Their suppression, I might add, is regarded by many historians, not just Catholic historians either, as almost certainly having contributed directly to the French Revolution, because they had been in charge of tertiary and secondary education across Europe. And when they were removed, the gap was filled by secularists and revolutionaries and Enlightenment thinkers. Well, after Bonaparte was finally defeated, the Jesuits were restored by Pope Pius VII in 1815, after the Battle of Waterloo. In fact, I think it was 1814, before the battle. They reformed themselves as Jesuits, having never ceased to live their full, solemn, final, perpetual vows, faithful to the last. Some people say they were never the same again, and I'm inclined to believe that, but what is not in any doubt is that they had never for 1 minute abandoned their vows. This then, I suggest, is the classic example of religious who were expelled from their order and their order suppressed, but whose vows did not cease because they could not cease, their vows being perpetual. And the Jesuits remained entirely faithful under St. Joseph of Pignatelli, a saint for very good reasons, to those continuing vows. Now, as all should know, the model and exemplar of the evangelical councils and the three vows of religion is, like everything else in the Church, the Holy Family. Our Lord, Our Lady, and St. Joseph. How am I going for time? All right. They were reckoned, as we heard, I think, from Sebastian, to have been part of the Essene community. And whether or not they had taken the vows of religion within that community, they were and remain the model, as by common consent and the teaching of the Church, of all Catholic religious life. Not St. Benedict, not St. Dominic, not St. Francis, not even St. Anthony of Egypt, but the Holy Family. That's the model for religious life. Indeed, it's the model for all of our lives, including married life, because they were married. They were everything. They were married, they were religious, they were upper class, they were lower class, they were middle class, they were everything. You name it, the Holy Family is in and of itself the whole of Christian living. However, they, as I say, were the model of religious life and of religious vows even before the Church had been created. So vows cannot be a creature of ecclesiastical discipline. They existed before the Church did. By the same token, Dante argues that the empire and the emperor were not a creation of the Church because they existed before the Church. He's right, of course. This, I suggest, further shows that the vows of religion precede the existence of the Church, and so our fortiori cannot be said to be a creature of the Church or of mere ecclesiastical discipline. Indeed, it would be odd if the very perfection of the Christian life, the evangelical councils, were no more than a creature of ecclesiastical discipline, invented by the imagination of some prelate, rather than the heart and centre of the whole of the gospel and of Christianity. In his famous work, De Perfectione Vitae Religionis, on the perfection of the religious life, St. Thomas himself shows that the perfection of religious life existed long before the advent of our Lord, and that Abraham himself was a prime exemplar, despite having great riches, plurality of wives, and no immediate superior whom he was bound to obey, save, of course, God. And explaining the pinnacle of perfection is found in the vows of religion. St. Thomas goes on to say this in that famous work, which I warmly recommend you read. The virtue of Abraham was therefore very great, so that although he possessed great wealth, his soul was detached from wealth. In a similar way, Samson's strength was great, since, armed only with the jawbone of an ass, he slew many enemies. And yet counsel is not uselessly given to a soldier to take up arms in combat with his foes. Take up arms. Neither, then, is it useless to counsel those who desire perfection to renounce their earthly goods, although Abraham was perfect with all his wealth. Likewise, as regards the vow of chastity, he quotes St. Augustine thus: Abraham, who fathered sons, was equal in continence to the Virgin St. John. Quite a statement, that. The marriage of the one and the celibacy, or continence is probably a better word, translation, of the other, fought each in their season for Christ. Therefore, any one of the faithful who observes continence may say, I am certainly no better than Abraham. But the chastity of continency is superior to the chastity of married life. Abraham practiced the one actually, the other habitually. For he lived chastely as a husband, and could have lived continently had he been married. The latter state, however, did not befit the time at which he lived, according to God's will. St. Thomas goes on to say, the solution of Augustine is in harmony with what was said above about poverty. For Abraham had so great spiritual perfection in virtue that his spirit did not fall short of perfect love for God on account either of temporal possessions or of married life. But if another man who does not have the same spiritual virtues strives to attain perfection while retaining riches and entering into marriage, his error in presuming to treat our Lord's words as of small account will soon be demonstrated. Thus, it is readily seen that the vows of religion pertain to the inner disposition of the soul, far more than to mere externals. So, for example, a bad religious would not be as good as a very virtuous married person, because they weren't living their condition, and the married person was. So it's a matter of internal disposition, not what religious order you belong to or what label you wear. It is often said the habit does not make a monk, and rightly so. What makes a monk is his internal dispositions. Likewise, the vows of religion, whilst they follow the pattern of poverty, chastity, and obedience, can be lived in a wide variety of different ways, the interior disposition being the essential element, not some mere external set of stipulations devised by mere ecclesiastical law or discipline, or imposed by some incompetent interfering pope or bishop. I wonder who I have in mind. This seems to be something that many Catholics, including the late unlamented Pope, could not fully grasp. Having said that, there are two theologians I can name in the past who were of the opinion that religious vows could be dispensed by the Pope. But neither of them makes it clear that they are speaking of solemn final perpetual vows or of something less than that. And I pause to add that neither of them are saints and neither of them are doctors of the Church. I'm referring to Cardinal Thomas Cajetan and Francisco Suarez. Both of them comment on the teaching of St. Thomas, and specifically on that section I quoted to you, and upon Cum ad Monasterium of Pope Innocent III cited earlier. Cajetan and Suarez say that St. Thomas misunderstood Pope Innocent III's decretal, and that interpreting Stante Monachatu, Pope Innocent III was saying this: just as I can't allow someone to be a monk and nevertheless to marry, so I can't allow someone to be a monk and have his own property. In other words, what they're suggesting is that Innocent was not considering the question of whether he had power to dispense a solemnly professed religious from a religious state, but only whether, while continuing to be a solemnly professed religious, they could marry or own private property. Well, why would you need a decretal to state anything so plain and obvious? Do we need a decretal to say that the sky is blue and the grass is green? No, of course not. Moreover, it is at least prima facie unlikely that St. Thomas would have misunderstood a decretal so close to him in time. Well, Cajetan, in his commentary on question 88, article 11 of Secunda Secundae, says that popes have, quote, on many occasions dispensed. But tellingly, he could only name two. And for those, he provides zero evidence. He claimed that Queen Empress Constance of Sicily, wife of Emperor Henry VI, was dispensed from solemn final perpetual vows. However, most historians regard this as no more than a legend, and as I say, Cajetan provides no evidence for it whatsoever. The case of Queen Empress Constance is quite hopeless, as an example. According to De Mulieribus Claris, her father, to avoid a prophecy that she would be harmful for the kingdom of Sicily, shut her up in a convent and forced her against her will to take the veil so she couldn't marry, produce offspring and become a disaster, as he saw it, to Sicily. That is a locus classicus for annulment of vows, just as it would be for marriage if indeed she had taken any vows, and there is zero evidence that she did take any vows. Suarez himself also cites King Casimir I of Poland. But this too isn't a good example. Very little is known of his early years, save that his parents sent him to a Polish convent in 1026 to get an education. That, of course, does not make him a monk or a religious. Many of the nobility were sent to convents to be educated in those days. Polish historians opine that he was possibly an oblate of the monastery, but certainly no more. And in any case, he left the convent for good in 1031, unvowed and undispensed. But Cajetan and Suarez also cite the more interesting case of King Ramiro II of Aragon, the so-called monk king, saying he was dispensed, but there is no evidence that any pope ever dispensed him at all, or even that he took vows, let alone solemn final perpetual vows. The legend of King Ramiro II, the monk, is so obscure that it's not, as I say, at all clear what vows, if any, he took. He's said to have been placed in the Benedictine monastery of Saint-Pont de Thomières-Béziers and to have been elected later abbot of Santos Facundo y Primitivo Sahagún, a Castilian royal monastic house, and later of San Pedro el Viejo in Huesca, and that he was elected Bishop of Burgos and Bishop of Pamplona. Elected or not, both appointments were blocked, and he was never consecrated a bishop, or, so far as we know, ordained to major orders. Was he in vows? There is zero evidence for it. Moreover, secular abbots in commendam, i.e. holding in trust, already existed. Was he one? Who knows? Ramiro was the youngest son of Sancho Ramirez, King of Aragon and Navarre, and Felicia of Rusi, and it was then not at all uncommon for noblemen to be elected abbots without being in vows, even though this was technically an abuse. Indeed, one of my own ancestors is an example. Gilbert Kennedy, 6th Lord Kennedy and 4th Earl of Castles, who, despite having fought for Mary Queen of Scots at Langside, the Battle of Langside in 1568, became a Protestant when he married Margaret, daughter of John Lyon, 7th Lord Glamis, ancestor of our late Queen Mother. Castles forced in 1565 Alan Stewart, then himself lay, or shall I say secular, commendator, that's to say trustee abbot, to hand over to him the Abbey of Cross-Ragul. Alan Stewart himself had taken no vows. He was a secular commendator of the abbey. And he did so by inviting him to his castle of Dunure, and in particular into the so-called Black Vault of Dunure, and there seizing him and roasting him over a fire, until Stewart relented and agreed to sign over the Abbey of Cross-Ragul. The Laird of Bargany, his cousin, rescued Stewart, and unsurprisingly a feud ensued between Bargany and Castles. But Cross-Ragul had had at least 4 secular commendators or pensioners, and long prior to the Reformation, and none of them had been in any kind of vows, let alone solemn final perpetual vows. In 1134, Ramiro had been elected Bishop of Barbastro Roda, but again, there's no evidence that he was a cleric at the time of his election, let alone a cleric of major orders, when the death of his childless brother made him one of the candidates for succession to the crown, and it became necessary for him to marry so as to procure an heir. This suggests that he never had any dispensations, since priestly orders are an absolute impediment to marriage, and he cannot have therefore been a priest or a bishop. Indeed, he can't have taken any final solemn, or indeed any vows. Indeed, in 1800, the Pope's then Secretary of State, Ercole the Marquis di Consalvi, had been made a cardinal, whilst only in minor orders, and he only became a deacon in 1801, and he was never a priest or a bishop. Having said that, Holy Roman Emperors were always ordained, since the time of Charlemagne, subdeacons at their coronation, and from the time of the Emperor Charles V, they were always ordained deacon by the Pope or his legate, but that was not regarded as an impediment to their marriage. So clearly, at least in relation to the deacon and subdeacon, the normal stipulation against marriage is dispensable. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence that it's dispensable in the case of priests or bishops. Indeed, several of them had more than one wife. For example, the Emperor Ferdinand II, Ferdinand III, Leopold I, Joseph II, and Francis II. Francis II had 4 wives. I mean, obviously after they died, not all at the same time or but through divorce. All, save Joseph II, for other reasons, because he was basically a Freemason, were in good standing with the church. Cajetan argues that if the church can cause, this is an interesting argument, can cause someone to cease to be the emperor, despite the man having been anointed as such, then, says Cajetan, a fortiori, she can also cause someone to be no longer a religious. Well, this is a commendably high idea of the sacrality of the emperor, but even I would not suggest that the anointing of an emperor is equivalent to the 3 vows of religion. Suarez also thinks that the Pope can dispense religious vows and says that this opinion is, quote, much more common than St. Thomas's opinion. But as so often with Suarez, he produces no evidence for his claim. Well, I put these commentaries of Cajetan and Suarez, and by the way, I have the Latin texts if anybody wants to have a look at them, to Reverend Father Thomas Crean, OP, a Dominican priest who has been here at the Roman Forum, together with the original Latin texts, and said to him, is this really what Suarez says, or have I misinterpreted his Latin? And here's what Father Thomas Crean said to me. Dear Jamie, that text from Suarez is one of the most bizarre things I have ever read. He doesn't spend much time there on our question, since he has discussed it in detail earlier on, in asking the question whether the religious state established by solemn vows can be annulled by the Pope. Here he spends more time on the question of whether the Pope can dispense a solemn vow permanently or temporarily while the religious state remains. And, believe it or not, he thinks he can. He thinks that if it were necessary for civic peace, that the Pope could give a monk permission to marry, I suppose he has in mind the heir of a noble or royal family contracting an alliance with another noble or royal house, on the condition that as soon as an heir had been sired by the monk, he would return to his monastery and resume his monastic life. Well, what about the poor wife and the child? Oh, don't worry about them. He also considers the case where there is need not to produce an heir, but to legitimate a child whom a monk had sired before entering the monastery. He says that in such a case, the Pope could give the monk the permission, while remaining religious, to marry, and thus to legitimate his illegitimate child from before he entered the monastery, so long as he has no conjugal relations with his wife and returns to the monastery. The whole thing is fantastic, says Father Thomas. His justification for it is that when a married couple take religious vows by mutual consent, which of course they can do, they are religious and married at the same time, like the Holy Family. He concludes that there is no incompatibility, therefore, between the 2 attributes, being married and being religious. All right so far. And that therefore the papal plenitude of power can combine these 2 things for any just cause. Obviously, says Father Thomas, the response to this is that while there is no strict incompatibility between being a religious and being married, there certainly is between being a religious and getting married. These opinions of Suarez are utterly bizarre. Yet, as I say, I had the text in Latin for anyone who wishes to read them for himself, if you're still incredulous. So, let us conclude. Thus, based upon the sources, the tradition of the Church and the foregoing, it is, in my submission, abundantly clear that the solemn final perpetual vows simply cannot be dispensed by any human authority at all, and that those who think otherwise and believe their vows have been dispensed or cancelled are mistaken, however innocent their belief. And I'm sure most of the people who believe that are innocent in their belief. Religious in final solemn perpetual vows should glory in their condition and not lament. They should instead remember those words of our Lord said to the apostles after his encounter with a rich young man recounted in the Gospel of St. Mark. And I quote, Mark 10:29-31. Jesus answering said, Amen, I say to you, there is no man who hath left house, or brethren, or sisters, or father, or mother, or children, or lands, for my sake and for the gospel, who shall not receive 100 times as much. Now, in this time, houses, brethren, sisters, mothers, children, and lands, with persecutions, and in the world to come, life everlasting. But many there are first shall be last, and the last first. A suitable admonition. Without religious life, the gospel, and to some extent the church, are eclipsed. That is why Satan wishes to destroy religious life, and why all religious must, for the sake of us all, remain firm in their commitment, the commitment that they have very generously and very nobly made. The very heart and centre of the church's life depends upon it. Thank you very much.